Hello, everyone. This is Monica Ramirez, the Warrior of Love, and thank you for being in Soul Talk. Today, we have a grief coach. Her name is Suzanne. I hope I don't massacre her last name. Jabour.
Perfect.
Oh my gosh, good. and she's a certified grief coach, and we're gonna be diving in because many of us we do not understand what it is. The grief is not only of losing someone, but we're gonna go more into it. Suzanne, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it to be in Soul Talk.
Thank you so much for having me.
Suzanne, tell us a little bit about uh, how to make you start going to become a grief coach.
So, what's so interesting about the grief space is sadly, most of us are here because of our own experience. I have yet to encounter someone who works in the grief space in whatever role that isn't there because they experienced a loss that, ruptured their life to the point that they were rebuilding and turning into something different. And they've ended up working in the grief space. And that's certainly what happened to me. For me, my most recent loss, which was the one that completely upended my world, was my son, Ben. He died in September of 2020, and I literally received that middle of the night phone call that every parent dreads. And that loss and that grief were unrecognizable compared to the ones I had experienced in the past. And in a weird way, I'm grateful that Ben's death wasn't my first loss of someone really close to me. Sadly, my dad died when I was in my early 30s and my mom when I was in my mid 40s. So I had already experienced sort of losses that were too early of people that were very close to me. And there's something about the out of order death of a child that is next level, certainly was for me. And I think is for most parents that have that experience, which sadly is far too common. And what I discovered was that I didn't know enough about grief to be able to do it. So that really set me down that path of having to be a student of it and figure it out and learn about it, literally at times for my own sanity, because I thought there was something wrong with me because of the things I was experiencing physiologically in my brain, the stuff that nobody talks about because we still have this collective silence and taboo around grief. And that's really what set me down this path of then becoming a grief educator and pivoting my coaching. And really now, eat, sleeping, and breathing grief in a way that I'm sure to some sounds really odd, but to me feels really hopeful because I really believe that if we understand grief better, and if I can have a role in that as an educator and speaker, then when it happens to us or it happens to someone close to us and we want to reach out with support, or we want to just understand what's happening to us so we feel less scared, education will help us do that. So for me, this is actually a really hopeful mission and vocation and profession. And it doesn't feel sad and heavy at all. And I know that sounds counterintuitive to people, but hopefully they will find that our conversation is that way because it really, grief is inevitable. It's going to happen to all of us. And if we have a little bit more comfort with being uncomfortable and with trying new things to help each other and new ways of talking about it, we can really change that experience to one where what happens is we build incredibly deep connections. Because that's what happened for me. People either disappeared, which was most of them, or the few that, the few and the brave, really now we can talk about anything because we have that kind of relationship.
Okay, let's go step by step and
Yeah.
define what it is grief to start because there are so many misconceptions about grief. So it's not only about the death of a loved one, it is way more than that. It can be going from a divorce, changing jobs, city, etc., etc. So let's dive in. How about that?
Yeah, to me, the simplest definition is that grief is the normal response to loss of all kinds.
Yes.
It's that simple. It's normal. It's a response we have to loss. And when we understand that all change brings loss and all loss brings grief, we can see that actually it's not a rare mystical thing. it's happening around us all the time to varying degrees. And not all of those losses is going to be like the death of a child, obviously. And what's great about those other losses is it gives us a place to practice how we want to show up for each other and how we want to experience it ourselves. It gives us a chance to connect to our emotions, a chance to understand that this might mess with our sleep and our digestion, and it gives us brain fog and all the things. Because when it comes to the death of a loved one, those really big ruptures in our lives, that's a really scary place to try and practice new skills, right? We don't get our driver's license and drive across the country. We get our driver's license and drive to the corner store. So when we can see that those other losses give us these opportunities to practice, that's our drives to the corner store, right? And then when someone has the loss of someone really close to them, whatever their title in their life, because I think that's another misunderstanding we have. We kind of expect grief to be, for a parent, a sibling, a child, maybe a close friend, but we want to put labels on our relationships with people, and that's not really how grief works. It depends a lot on how intrinsic that person is into your life and how much you deal with them on a regular basis. That really impacts our level of grief. But we want to understand that it really is, as you say, it's the loss of a job, the loss of a business, the loss of an opportunity, the loss of a relationship, a divorce, a separation, an estrangement, a friendship. It's pet loss. It's everything. And, if we think about our last 4 years in this time as a collective on the planet, we're experiencing losses of all sorts, right? There's two big wars raging. There's environmental concerns and issues and catastrophes. There's, so much going on that's activating all of this grief that we're scared to talk about.
Now, do you know the symptoms of grief? Because many of us, we thought, oh, I already overcome the death of my mother. Let's put it like that. She
Yeah.
died 2 years ago. And time to time, I catch myself, am I still sad for that? And to many of us, it might be happening. They were all our viewers. So, can you give some symptoms for?
Yeah, absolutely. There's very normal, very common symptoms that we just don't know are that because we're not talking about them. So I think the biggest impact for most people comes from the brain fog or the grief brain. And that's happening because our brain is literally rewiring itself to make sense of our new reality. And so it's really foggy. So things like directions, things like doing things where there's multiple steps that have to happen in a certain order can be really difficult. And our brain just feels fuzzy. And that, I don't know, sadly or hopefully, or I don't know, feel about it how you will. The latest thing I read about it was talking about that impact lasting for about 5 years. So when you say, oh, but it was 2 years ago and like I should be over this by now, really not. That's the biggest myth we've been fed is the timeline and how sort of quick and quiet this is all supposed to be. And in fact, it's long and messy. So the brain fog is one. I think that was the scariest to me because I really thought that something had gone wrong in my brain when in fact it was just doing what it's supposed to do. Many people have sleep disruption. They're either sleeping too much or not enough, and most of it's not restful. Digestive issues are really common. So nausea, upset, all of the digestion, all of the digestive things that go awry. Weak muscles. So becoming really clumsy is quite common. That people don't think about that, but you might think back and realize, oh yeah, I was just clumsy. I was bumping into things and falling and all of that. Muscle weakness is really common. Um, it messes with our relationship with time. And especially in that acute phase, that earliest sort of 6 to 9 months, having any idea what day or time it is, it's very normal to have no clue and not really know what that's about. Um, Digestion, muscles, sleep, immunity. It affects our immunity. So you maybe get sicker, more colds and flus. Pretty much every system in our body, our sympathetic nervous system is in fight or flight much of the time. So it's really helpful if we can focus on activating our parasympathetic system. But really, every system in our body is impacted. And we're not talking about that enough because it's a physical, full-on, full-bodied experience. It's not just our emotions. It's awkward enough for us to talk about that because especially in North America and Western culture, we're not good at talking about emotions. That's bad enough, but then there's also all this physical stuff going on that no one tells us about and is really can be really scary.
And not only that, something that it came right now to my mind, it is the programs. Like, let's put it like that. You you're supposed to be a mother and your son should die after you.
Yeah.
Or I was the daughter, in my case, I was the daughter that I was taking care of my parents until the last day. And after they died, it's like, okay, how do I define myself now?
Yes.
I don't
And
know.
that's another loss that you have to grieve,
Yes,
right? That sense of, and I knew I was very clear. The person I was before didn't exist anymore. I knew that almost instantly. I was like, well, she is done. And who on earth am I now? And it's not that I'm not still a mother of two. I will be a mother of two forever. And, my role as Ben's mom has changed. Who I am has completely changed. It's a really, really interesting experience because that's all happening in those earliest days where you're full on in the heavy grief of having just experienced the death of a loved one.
that is so true. Because you have to reinvent yourself
Yep.
and again who you are. It's like the same applies for a divorce.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm coaching divorced couples and so forth, and they have to refine, okay, do I like? What colors do I like? Because we tend to do so many compromises with our loved ones.
Yes.
Like, okay, you want the color of the walls dark. Okay, let's put it like that. And after the divorce or grief or whatever, you need to define what colors you like, what food you like, what music you like, who you are after them.
Yes. Because we're so entwined, right? When it's someone who we're so entwined with, and Ben still lived with me. He was only 22. He still lived with me. So he was a part of my day-to-day, everyday life. And it's so interesting when you think about all of the things, in your home, the decor, as you say, the music you listen to, the candles you light, so many things are decisions either that you made together or that you have because they liked it and it's neutral for you, but they really liked it, so you have it. I mean, for us, it goes as far as we have a dog now. And we would never have had a dog if Ben still lived here because he didn't want one. So that was fine. This was his home too. We didn't have a dog. After he died, my daughter decided we needed a dog, which actually was brilliant in hindsight because there's something about having a pet that needs you, someone who needs you, that was very helpful ultimately. And at that point, I would have done anything that I thought would help her. So we got a dog, but we have a dog because Ben is dead.
Yeah, I got a dog.
Yeah, it's funny. It's one of the things I often talk with clients about, especially if they live on their own, if it's the loss of a spouse or someone that was the only person that lived in the home with them and now they're by themselves. There's something about having another heartbeat in the house that makes a really big difference.
Yes, and personally, more than dogs, more than cats, in my own experience, is the unconditional love that the dog is gonna give you, no
Absolutely.
matter what. The cats depends on the personality of
That's not
the cat.
necessarily the same way.
They can be loving and so forth, some,
Yeah,
but it is not like the energy that gives us the dog, that it is unconditional love,
yeah,
basically. And
yeah,
that is gonna bring
absolutely.
you back to life so many times.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So yes. So how do you work with people? And after they arrive with you, they finally look for help because many of them they take long to look for help.
Yes.
They don't understand it, like, oh, I'm grieving because someone died. But it can be, I just moved to a new city, a new place, a new country, new whatever,
Mm-hmm.
and I feel overwhelmed and alone and all the symptoms of the grief.
Yeah.
And how do you work with them when they arrive with you?
So, my approach when I'm coaching is to help people be conscious and curious. That's became my mantra. It was my path to survival. And it really is about being conscious of all of the emotions, especially for us who grew up in Western culture in North America. That's not how we were raised, right? We were raised that there's good emotions and bad emotions, and you stuff the bad ones, and you're not supposed to be, especially for women, right? Especially for girls, you're not supposed to be angry and mad and disappointed and despairing and all of that stuff. That is what happens in grief. So it's that idea of being conscious of all of the emotions, learning to name them, learning to feel them. And if we're already good at that, getting even better. So that's the conscious piece, just aware of what's happening moment to moment. That's a lot about emotions and mindfulness, emotional intelligence and resilience. And then the curiosity is that aspect that we were talking about where you really need to reinvent yourself and re-establish who you are now, what's important to you, what are your, what are your priorities, what are your morals and ethics, what are your gaps, right? I spend a lot of time with clients identifying gaps, and sometimes there's skill gaps, right? Our person did particular jobs around the house that we have no idea how to do. So you either have to learn how to do them or find someone who knows how to do them, right? So there's skill gaps. There's often support gaps, right? That person supported us in, when something went wrong, that's who we called. Okay, well, but that's now not possible. So who in your sphere, or who do you need to develop to be that person? So there's all those kind of gaps we explore, but it really is about being conscious and curious and then finding a path. It's not going to be the same path as mine. It's not going to be the same as anybody else's. It's one breath, one decision, one small step at a time, finding a path to whatever life is going to be next. And even that isn't a forever decision, because if there's something we learn from grief, especially when it's from the loss of someone close to us, is that there is no forever. Nothing is permanent. And so it's the next thing. What is the next thing? How do we fill those gaps? How do we create a life that feels hopeful and feels possible? And one of the things that's really critical to me is, how do we build that life so that it includes our loved one? Because there's many ways for us to carry them with us. And I think the sayings, that the cliches that come up about, sort of getting over it and moving on and all of that, really discourage and almost make it seem like we're supposed to leave our loved one behind us. And I don't think that's true. I know I will carry Ben with me forever, the same way I carry my dad, the same way I carry my mom and other loved ones that have died before me. So how do we build a life that, respects them, respects how we want to carry them with us, however that is, and that really honors that there is a life left to be lived and it's ours. And we get to build that life that honors them, but is as guilt-free as possible.
Something that I encountered after the death of my parents. Well, my dad was 20 years ago, and I was looking for who's going to substitute, who's going to take his place.
Mm-hmm.
And then I noticed with my mom. And yes, I find some people that could fill that space of dad or mom. And but then it's when I realized, oh, they're not them.
No.
And that was more painful. It was like going all over again to the time of their death again.
Yeah.
We're looking at substitutes, correct?
Yes. Yeah. And when I talk about gaps and having to fill those gaps, we're not looking for substitutes, right? I'm not looking for another son. And there are things that Ben provided in my life that I still want to have. So then I either open that space for someone else to be able to do it, or I figure out myself how to do it. And that's the kind of the choices that we get to make. But I think that trying to pretend that they didn't leave a bunch of gaps leaves us ending up feeling really lonely and isolated, because inevitably they're going to leave gaps because they filled a rich role in our life. And if we still want a life that feels rich and full, we probably still want many of those things, right? And so it's not that you're looking for a substitute or a replacement or a new version of them. And, there are things that they provided for us that we want to continue to have.
And another question about that.
Yeah.
It is there is unresolved issues at the time that they're not here anymore. I remember in my case, when my mother was dying, and I always felt when they were gonna die before. But in the case of my mother, that it was 3 years ago, I hired a coach before she died. It's like, I need
Mm,
to forgive her before she died, because or else I'm gonna have more issues after when she died.
yeah.
And I went to the process before she even did it. So like that, I
Hmm.
can forgive her before. So, and I bet many people have unresolved issues because some of them, the death is slowly. She was 85, 89, but other people is in a car accident or is in something super fast. They don't have the time to say goodbye or
Hmm.
resolve any issue. How do you work with that? Hola, ¿qué tal? Mi nombre es Mónica Ramírez, la guerrera del amor. Los quiero invitar a un diplomado que es de transformación en metamorfosis, como mi libro que acaba de salir. Pero en este diplomado que vamos a hacer es por 12 semanas, va a ser conmigo en línea. No tienes que hacer esto solo, porque yo anteriormente me sentía que yo no valía, que yo no era suficiente. Y entonces, ¿cómo me iba a traer realmente la vida que yo quería? Tuve que hacer precisamente este tipo de transformaciones y el trabajo interno para poder salir de donde me encontraba, dejando ir todos los traumas ancestrales que yo venía cargando, como todos ustedes, entender que era un programa para empezar. Y como programadora neurolingüística aprendí precisamente a remover esos programas y a poner los programas que yo quiero tener en mi vida para que mi experiencia sea muy diferente a la que fue. Si quieres aprender a dejar ir las culpas, las vergüenzas, los miedos, el miedo, el juicio a los demás o el miedo de ser exitoso, porque muchas veces nos saboteamos a nosotros mismos. Soy programadora neurolingüística, soy hipnoterapista, soy life coach, también soy especialista en creencias limitantes y mucho más. Y estoy aquí realmente para servirte. Esta es mi misión de vida y mi propósito de vida y lo quiero compartir contigo. Empezamos el 27 de febrero a las 7 de la noche. ¿Quieras unir a nosotros en este grupo que vamos a hacer? Que empezamos muy pronto. Mi nombre es Mónica Ramírez, la guerrera del amor, y únete a este programa de transformación en metamorfosis. Este diplomado realmente va a cambiar tu vida.
Very many slash most of us, I think, are in that situation, right? Where there's unresolved issues, there's unfinished conversations, there's, niggling things that you wish you had said or done or expressed or whatever it is. Um, and there are some ways to do that, right? We can write letters. I used to write letters to my parents when would come across something and think, oh, I wish I had resolved that with them. There's ways for us to process it without them here. Letter writing is a great one, talking with someone else about it, finding a coach or a counselor or a therapist or whatever who has some skills that can help you work through it. And really, I think we also have a choice to make about whether we let ourselves get caught in the swirl of that. It's very easy, especially on the grief path, to get caught in the swirl of regret and guilt and wishful thinking, right? So, what I work with clients to do is start to notice that swirl before they're in it. Because if you can see it coming, then you get to make a choice about how you interact with it, right? Because from my perspective, there's not a lot of win in that swirl, right? It tends to be a downward spiral as opposed to being neutral or upward, right? And for most of us, we don't choose that downward spiral. We would choose something different. So part of it is becoming more aware of what tends to activate that, right? Often it's what used to happen for me with my mom after my mom died is I would see mothers and daughters around the same age doing something fun together, so I could make up a story about their relationship and how perfect it was. And of course my relationship with my mom was imperfect, like all of them. But I know that really, would start me swirling and thinking about the conversations we hadn't had or the things I wished I had said. So getting to be able to recognize what activates that and then making a choice about how I wanted to interact with it. Was this a time where I wanted to just be really thinking about, oh, I wish I had said, I wish I had done. That doesn't really serve anything. I don't usually choose that. but I could write a letter, or I could have a conversation with her, or I could go visit the place where she's buried and feel that connection with her. I often will put on a piece of her jewelry because I just want to feel that connection with her. So being able to recognize it is great, and a way that you can then make a choice about whether you want to interact with it or not. If you're in the swirl, then I work with clients to talk about what are like the lifelines out of it. So what are the things you can grab onto? You know, if you think about a whirlpool in a river, for example, there's always branches on the side. So what are your branches that you can grab onto so you don't just stay spinning? Because we don't want to stay spinning. There's nothing happening there, right? We want to be on this path of rebuilding our life, and we can't do that if we're in the spin. So
Yes.
what are your lifelines? What are your branches to grab if you find yourself in that whirlpool that help you get out of it as quickly as possible? Because that path of feeling guilty, feeling shame, feeling, the wishful thinking, there's not a lot to be gained, if anything, on those paths. So if we can recognize them and acknowledge, yeah, I could choose to go down that and really just be in the swirl of emotions that are not really helping me, but we need to feel them, right? It's such a delicate balance. Or do I look at it and go, you know what? There's actually, in reality, nothing for me to feel guilty about. I did everything I knew how to do. I love them with all my heart, whatever it is. Really thinking about what's the truth of that story and how much of it is made up, and just allowing us to feel guilty. For most of us, there's not much to feel guilty about when we break it down really to what's true and we really dig into that story. So that's how I help people deal with it.
Something that I brought me that just thought about this. It is There is also I am a neurolinguistic programmer, so I always go to
Mm-hmm.
programs. And there's a program how long you can be sad. It is okay, you're 3 months, 6 months, and after that it is a depression and you need antidepressants and so and so. And what they do is basically numb the emotions that you still working it out.
Yeah.
So for the viewers, that how long do you think it is a healthy, of course, they can get a coach or healer or grieving coach since the next day or the same day.
Yeah.
But for many people, they're afraid. They're still afraid to go and search for help.
Yeah.
So how long it is the normal part that is like, okay, you really need to go and see someone.
Yeah, it's way longer than we've been told. So the best definition kind of the timeline that makes the most sense to me is one that I learned from David Kessler in a workshop of his that I did. And he talks about the acute phase. So that's the first 6 to 9 months. So if you're within that 6 to 9 month mark and you're still really struggling, feeling very sad, crying lots, not sleeping very well, having all of those symptoms we were talking about, that's normal,
Mhm.
right? So it's way longer than we've been led to believe. He then puts early grief at the first 2 years. So I know there's now a clinical diagnosis at the 1 year mark. I find that wildly problematic. And I also understand that if people want to access help in the system that we have, you often need a diagnosis to get the funding. So I can live with us having to put a diagnosis on something that's normal, even though that's also very frustrating to me. Because if people need help and they need a diagnosis to get the funding, we need a diagnosis. But the reality is that early phase is the first 2 years. And for many people, the second year is worse than the first. Because that first year is such a blur for many of us. We know because we've been told it's going to be hard. All of those firsts are going to be hard. The first birthdays and Christmases and Thanksgivings and Easters and, all of the things are all going to be hard. We've been told that. Often the second ones are worse. Something tends to shift at the 2 year mark because we've survived the firsts and then we've survived the seconds, where we kind of had to start thinking about, what do we want this event to be now? Like, we've survived one of them, and now what is what the second one tends to be about. After that 2 year mark, then we're moving into mature grief, and that really lasts forever. So it's so problematic to me when people will say things to me like, oh, but like it was 5 years ago, I shouldn't feel sad about that anymore. And I think, well, but why not? Like, of course you're going to have griefy moments. And there's going to be things that activate your grief. And that's okay. That's going to happen forever. I still have moments. My dad died over 25 years ago. I still have moments where that loss is so right in my face.
Yeah.
It's 25 years ago. I don't cry about it hardly ever anymore, right? That, depth of grief has lifted. And there's been other losses since. But I still have moments where I think, oh, I just wish he was here. He
Yeah.
would love that, or that would make him laugh, or I would love to be able to share this story with him. That's 25 years ago. It's a forever thing. And that's why it's so important to me that we talk about how do we integrate those people with us? How do we carry them with us? How do we remember them? And how do we honor those griefy moments? You're not going to be crying every day 25 years later. If you are, you needed to find help about 20 years ago, right? But those first 2 years, there's going to be griefy moments regularly. After that, they get further and further apart. You can sometimes see them coming. We know around the anniversary of their death, it's going to be griefy. It just is. And that's okay, probably forever, right? For me, I know those days, my dad's anniversary, my mom's anniversary, they're now 10 and 25 years ago, respectively. I still think about them more around that time or around their birthdays or around big holiday events where they would have been a big part of it, and they're not here.
Yes. And I also have lost family that it was my nephew.
Mm,
And I have seen my sister trying to overcome the grief of losing
yeah.
her son. Even it was my nephew, she was the mother.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of pain, it is very different than when it is logical, your parents are old, they're in their 80s and so forth, they're gonna leave. You're mentally prepared for that,
Yeah.
but not for the death of a son.
No.
Way deeper and how do you help someone that it is still in pain after 7, 8 years?
It's so interesting. I had someone tell me something very soon after Ben died. And at the time, I was really mad at them because it just sounded so horrifying. And now I'm so grateful because it makes perfect sense. And what they said to me was that the difference with the death of a child is that, when somebody dies, you have a wound. And over time, it scabs over and then it gets a scar. And then every once in a while, that scar pulls or something happens that, kind of makes you remember it's there. When it's the death of a child, you get to the part where it's scabbed over, but the scab never heals to a scar because it's torn open so often that it never makes that final step to be a scar. And I was so mad at him when he said that to me because I thought, how dare you wish that upon me? Like, that's what it felt like. And I was so angry. I didn't say that, of course, because I was being polite, but I was so mad inside. And now I totally get it. Because, if I think about my parents, yes, I have the scar and I know where it is. And I know sometimes you move in a way or something happens in that scar, like scar tissue, that scar gets, a little bit stretched or something happens to it. Ben's death, I don't think we'll ever get there. And so the gift of this other bereaved parent saying that was I no longer had the expectation that it would be the same. And that meant that I was able to navigate it a completely different way and give myself a lot of permission for whatever came to be all right. And so for me, we just had Ben's 4th anniversary. So he's been gone for 4 years now. And there are days when it's like it was yesterday. And there are days when it feels like forever ago. The same way that happens in that acute, very earliest phase. That still happens sometimes. And I think because it's the death of a child, it's going to be a heightened experience for the rest of forever. So I allow it. That's my answer is I had to get okay with that there are going to be moments, however long it took forever, where I would cry still.
But how do you support someone that it is grieving at the same time? Because now we're hearing the aspect of the person that is grieving,
Mm-hmm.
the aspect of the person that want to support and help people that are grieving? How do you do it?
So the most important thing for us to realize is we actually have what we say and what we do backwards. We tend to say something really kind of short and snappy that shuts down the conversation. And we tend to offer something like, anything you need, give me a call. The problem with that is what grievers need is witnessing. So we need people in our lives who can listen to our stories, who can hear about how sad we are, and help hold that grief and carry that grief with us. And that only comes from having said something really open-ended and really open-hearted and vulnerable. That's something you can do for a grieving parent. Because I will tell you 4 years after, however long after it is for your sister, for your nephew's mom, there are likely very few people left who are still prepared to do that. So if you are someone who can say, wow, I can imagine that you're going to be grieving that forever. And if there's ever a time you need to talk about it, like, can we go and have a coffee and just share memories or talk about him or say his name? That is so, so helpful because otherwise we're trying to do it all by ourselves, and that's actually not possible. Grief needs witnessing. And for bereaved parents, for that kind of a death, and I think it's similar for spouses too. I have this conversation often with widows and widowers. And they feel that loss for a very long time because it's the loss of their future too, right? If you think about it, there's a saying about, the loss of your parents being the loss of your past, the loss of your friends being the loss of your present, and the loss of your children being the loss of your future.
Yes.
I think when it's a spouse, that future piece is there as well. And I think that's part of what makes it take so much longer to really be able to get to that point of integration. So if you're someone who can have those conversations, invite them out for a coffee, right? Can we go have coffee and talk about Ben, right? Let's go. And can you just share what's really happening for you right now? And I'd love to tell you what's happening for me. That's a beautiful offer. When it comes to what we offer support-wise, practical things, we need to offer something really specific. Because anything you need, give me a call. That brain fog, griefy brain that we talked about, it can't do anything with that. That brain, there's no possibility that we can reach out. It doesn't work that way for almost anybody. So what you want to offer help-wise is very specific. I'm going to the grocery store this afternoon. Go open your fridge and tell me what's missing, and I'll bring it to you. Right? Do you need milk? Is it eggs? Is it cheese? Is it bread? Whatever, vegetables, fruits, whatever give them some suggestions. We can do that, something that specific. We want yes, no answers, those kind of questions, right? If it's a neighbor and we know time is disrupted, you could say, hey, you know what, on Thursdays when I take out my garbage, can I go into your backyard and take yours out too? Because I bet you often don't even know when it's Thursday. Right? Something very specific. And then the griever gets to decide. That's the key thing. It needs to all be griever centered. So for any offer you make, whether it's support emotionally, support with tangible things, it all needs to be okay for them to say no. And we need to understand as supporters that no means not that thing right now. It doesn't mean no forever. And so often when we hear no, we take it so personally and we think, oh, I did something wrong and I made it worse. And so I'm just not going to offer anymore. That's not it. Keep offering. Offer something different. Offer on a different day, whatever it is. It just means no right now. So very specific, tangible things that you can do. If there's something you like to do, offer that. Something you're doing anyway, offer to do it for them as well. That takes away that sense on the griever of feeling like a burden. If you're doing it anyway, right now it's fall where I live. Leaves are falling like mad. I'm going to the store to buy yard waste bags. Do you need some? I'll bring you some. Right? Everything you need, they need.
Mm-hmm.
Make that kind of an offer and you will get a yes much more often than if you say something like, anything you need, give me a call and let me know I'm here for you, which is often what we end up saying. But that ongoing emotional support really after that first couple of weeks to month, there's very few people showing up offering support at all. So if you're someone that has the ability to sit in quiet with someone who's feeling big emotions, offer that 6 months later, a year later, 18 months later, 2 years later. Hey, I was thinking about your loved one the other day. I'd love to go and have a coffee and talk about them. Would that be something you'd like to do? Absolutely. I would take somebody up on that offer anytime.
That is so, so true because, yes, we tend to, okay, let's not talk about it so like that you don't feel the pain again.
Yeah, we don't want to make them feel sad.
Yes,
We don't want to remind them. People say that to me all the time. Oh, but I don't want to remind them. They remember. The person grieving the death of a loved one, they remember. Every day of every moment of my life, I know Ben has died. That you remember too is a gift.
yeah, that is so, so true. In the Mexican tradition where I come from, we tend to have a big celebration on the November 2nd. Second is for the adults, the first is for the kids that they pass away.
Mhm.
So, and in our tradition is that they come those days to actually visit. So you put the favorite food or cigars or the liquor, whatever it is. But it is in a way a closing also
Mhm. Mhm.
that many people do not do this kind of rituals. So they don't have that close for that. And I, I believe in rituals are very important to make closing. It doesn't matter if
Yeah.
you want to do a Day of the Dead altar or go to the beach or whatever ritual you want to do. What rituals do you recommend for the majority of the people? See, I'm just talking about as a Mexican tradition. I have my Day of the Altar there,
Yeah.
and but not everybody follow this. What other ones you recommend?
Yeah, I think rituals are really important. And I think they give us a framework to operate within that feels comfortable. So, a lot of people create rituals around candles for whatever reason. We had that when my dad died. My daughter was three, maybe four, three and a half, something like that. Anyway, she was tiny. And we went to a candle lighting ceremony. He died at the end of September. Um, and we went to a candle lighting ceremony that Christmas that was to honor people who had died that year. And they had those little choir candles. And so my mom and myself and my daughter, I can't remember who else went with us. I think my husband at the time did. And anyway, some other people. But so we ended up with all these little candles. And so what we did, which was so powerful because you could do it with someone really little, is those became the grandpa candles. And every time we had a family gathering or we were having Christmas or Thanksgiving or we're having somebody's birthday, we would have the ritual of somebody lighting the grandpa candle. And that was our way of having my dad be there for that event. There's rituals like that you can do. You can build little altars. I think little altars are really helpful. I think having little mementos or little things that are meaningful to you connected to that person around us can be really, really helpful. It's those touchstones that allow us, the same way that the Day of the Dead does, is allows us that structure for our grief. So it's not just this big amorphous blob, which is what it feels like most of the time, that we're just swirling in this big soup of chaos. It gives us those touchstones. So candles can be really helpful. I know a lot of people who speak to their loved ones, and I know for some that sounds just silly, but for a lot of people, they get a lot of comfort with a morning and bedtime ritual where they either speak to them or they write them a little note. Some people write little notes. That can be really helpful. And you can do it on whatever schedule makes sense to you, right? If it's a daily ritual, great. If it's a weekly ritual, if it's a monthly ritual, maybe you write. One of my daughter's friends, actually, her dad died. Um, Gosh, it's probably 3 years ago now. And she writes a letter to him every year on her birthday that just summarizes all the things in the year. So it's a beautiful ritual for her to share her year purposefully with her dad.
That is a good one. I never occurred to that one, but
Yeah, beautiful, right? So she gets a she gets a memento of her year. Here's all the things. Oh, and she talks about, she shares them sometimes on Facebook. This is how I know that she does this. But she'll talk about, which nephews or nieces were born, because of course there's new births happening in the family that he's not going to know about. She talks about that. She talks about accomplishments she's had or trips they went on, amazing things. And she writes it once a year as a way of just being able to involve him in what's happening and to be able to tell him all the things that if he was still physically here, she'd be sharing with him. and be able to tell him. I think that's beautiful. Letter writing can be really powerful. Many people have a place they go to. So some people have a cemetery plot that they can visit. Many of us don't have something like that. That's not the choice that we made with our loved ones' remains. But if you have a place that's significant with that person or becomes significant to you after their death because it gave you comfort, that's a really great ritual to have a place that you visit that makes you think of them. Things that you do, we do trips sometimes and we call them revisit and reclaim. So we go intentionally back to places that we went to and loved going to with Ben to both relive those memories that we have of that place and to decide, what role does that place play in our life now? Is it somewhere we want to continue to go to? Or is it a place that we think, you know what, it's served our purpose and
I
we're just going to hold it as a place with memories?
personally, I find that very painful. In fact, I
Yes.
move out where I live because every single corner, every single street, I have memories of my parents,
Yep.
and it's too painful. So yes, we're moving soon. Precisely, I don't want to be here anymore.
Yeah. And that's the truth for some people. For me, doing that, knowing that it's going to be painful and hard, and that there's a gain at the end of it. That's why we do it so intentionally and we talk about it beforehand and we talk very purposefully about, where do we want to go visit that we know is going to be painful because it's places that we went to and visited with him and were important for our life with him. Where do we want to go visit that maybe we never went to when he went with us? And then how do we balance those two things? For a lot of people, their choice is to move and to never go back to those places. That's not what I wanted, so I made a different choice. And
Mhm.
as long as we're doing things intentionally and not out of avoidance,
Yeah,
both are fine. But we can't deny our grief. We can't avoid it. You can in the short term, but not in the long term. I was at one of my grief cafes the other day. We had someone come whose loss was 25 years ago. And she felt like it was the first time that she really had the time and the space and the ability to really grieve that loss. 25 years ago. So she's been having to live a life and, had a little baby at the time and had to, scramble and deal with all the finances and the housing and very good reasons that it's taken until now. And that grief is still there waiting. So if you're moving because that makes a lot of sense because you've thought about it and you've thought, yeah, this place is just too painful and I need some space from it to be able to deal with the pain. And then maybe I would come back to visit, or maybe I never would. That's okay. But if it's like, if I move away from here, I won't feel sad anymore,
yeah. No,
that's never going to work. Right. So it's about that, knowing that the grief is going to stay with you. It's inside your body. You don't get to move away from it. It's coming on the trip with you. It's moving to the new house with you. And many people find peace and relief from not being in the space or in the neighborhood or ever going back to the restaurant. That's not, for me, that's not what I wanted. I wanted to be able to stay living here. And we talked about moving for a while. And then we're like, no, we love it here. We're staying. So then it became about, okay, when I feel resilient and grounded and able, I go poke the bear. And I go to the places that I know will be painful. And I intentionally go and allow that to happen and have a good cry and move the emotions, right?
yeah.
As long as you know that grief is going with you, both decisions are fine. We just have to do them intentionally and consciously, and not in the hopes that if I move, it will be done. I'll be finished this pain. That's not how it works, unfortunately.
Hey, Suzanne, I know you're having a the Greek cafe you just mentioned.
Mhm.
Can you explain it a little bit more for our viewers because they might be candidates for that.
Yes, absolutely. The grief cafes happen twice a month. And they're a free drop-in group through Meetup. So you just go onto the Meetup app, either search for me or search for Grief Cafes, or I'm sure in the show notes will be my link tree. You can find them there. And they have become just a magical place for people to come together as grievers. So everybody in the room is grieving something. Some it's the loss of a loved one, some it's the loss of multiple loved ones. We've had people with pet loss and job loss and all kinds of losses. And it's been a beautiful place of non-judgment about that, where we just know that grief is grief is grief and it needs witnessing. And we come together to talk about it. So we do a round robin sharing. People just talk about what's happening for them. It's a place you can say their name. It's a place you can share a memory, or talk about, wow, this week I'm really struggling. Excuse me, I'm really struggling with X, Y, or Z, whatever it is. So those happen twice a month, and they're just a really powerful space to feel community and not feel so isolated, and to not feel like there's something wrong with you and you're the only one this is happening to. Because what we find from each other is that our experiences often are very similar.
And those are online or in person.
They're online, it's all on Zoom. So we've had people from all over North America.
Perfect. That is going to be very, very helpful for many of us that we're still working on that area.
Yeah.
And but you have other programs too, you mentioned.
I do. Yeah. So I have a really amazing program that I do with a writing coach that we work together. She brings the writing expertise and I bring the grief expertise. And we call it grieving while writing, writing while grieving. And we do a new session about every 2 or 3 months. We're in the middle of one right now. And that's a space where we bring grievers together. We have a theme of the week. It's a 6 week program. We have a theme of the week, so we do a tiny bit of education or a tool or a technique that people can find helpful. The other day, we were talking about the parasympathetic nervous system and how to activate that and why it's so important, all the things it helps with. And then we do a free write. So my writing partner brings amazing, beautiful writing prompts, and we write to those prompts, and then people share what they wrote. So we share, how we're feeling, what came up with that writing. It's just a really powerful tool to excavate some of that stuff that we've stuffed, right? Because inevitably there's been something that we've denied or we've gone, oh, that's too painful or whatever it is. So it's a really lovely way to bring some of that back to our awareness when we're able. And what's beautiful about it is that because it's a free write, you're just writing whatever comes to you. So what comes to people often is something that's been just kind of niggling at the edges of their awareness. And when you bring it into awareness and you're talking about different tools and techniques and ways to process the emotions and move the grief, then it's really become a powerful tool for healing. So we do those regularly. Anybody can go to my website and all whatever workshops I have available at any given moment are there. And then I have one that's for leaders. So for people who are leaders in organizations or communities or just often take that role in their life. So they have really strong leadership skills and they really care about people, but they have this gap around grief and they don't really know how to show up to help people. That's a grief informed leadership program. And that's another 6 week course with me and a group of other leaders. And we come together to learn and practice the skills that we need to be able to really show up for people and understand grief better.
That is so nice because you're totally right. We were taught that we have to hide our emotions.
Yeah.
Taught that you're sad, hide, take antidepressives, distract yourself so you don't think and you don't feel.
Yeah.
And
That's
that,
a problem. That's a big problem.
yes,
Yeah, so that's often where we have to start. And that's why, the conscious is such a big part of when I'm working with clients who are grieving or even working with leaders who want to be able to step up. If we're not conscious of our own emotions, it's very difficult for us to hold those big emotions of someone else, right? If we're completely shut down and we don't know how to name anything beyond mad, sad, glad, we can't show up for someone who's in despair and sadness and hopelessness and we can't. When that's all entangled in love and hope and possibility, it's a big messy soup of emotions, and we need to be really aware of ours and how we hold them to be able to help others.
it has been my pleasure to have you in Soul Talk. Do you have something else that you would like to say before we close down?
I just want to really encourage people to think about whether they are giving themselves and others permission to grieve. Because we really live in a culture where we don't get that. Grief is supposed to be silent and quick and private, and that's just not how it works. So, really, to be aware of, are you giving yourself permission to feel those emotions? Are you a person who could give permission to someone else, no matter how long it's been, to be someone who can be a witness for them of their grief? That's our starting point. We need permission.
Yes. And to give ourselves permission.
Absolutely. That's where we have to start. Because sadly, I'm doing everything I can, and I know other people are too. And the shift in our culture is taking a while. So we have to start with giving it to ourselves.
Yes, I totally agree. Her information, Suzanne, is going to be in the below in this podcast. And so talk, you can find it in Captivate or YouTube, and you can get a hold of her. Her link tree is gonna be there. So like that, you can get all her programs, her cafe and everything. So like that, in your grieving, please go and visit her. And because it is not fair just to continue life grieving. It is a choice. Make the choice of loving you and letting go what it is so painful. So you can move forward in a different way that you have been moving today. Thank you so much, Suzanne, for being here. And I really, really appreciate this conversation, that it was very, very helpful.
Good.
And to the viewers, please share it with someone else, because everybody is passing through something. We're in changes. The world is going in changes. Thank you so much, Suzanne.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.